Asheville, North Carolina, June. My name is Isabel Grant. I'm 53 years old. I have a successful husband, a beautiful lakefront home, and a dining table so long, no one at it talks anymore. I used to be a painter. Not the gallery-type artist, but the kind who painted abstract pieces for upscale restaurants, places that needed color, not meaning. Now, I mostly write letters to myself I never send, bake pastries I don't eat, and have conversations with the pendant light above my stove. It doesn't answer, but it listens better than most. My husband, Richard, just flew to Boston. A week-long tech symposium. He kissed my cheek before leaving, didn't look me in the eye, and told me to make sure I eat dinner. He always says that. He's never asked if I enjoy it. He was the private chef I'd hired while Richard was gone. It was Sylvia's idea, my best friend. If you're bored, she said, you don't need therapy, darling. You need better seasoning. I didn't think I needed a chef. Then again, I didn't think I needed anyone. Luca Moretti, 28, from Florence, Italy. Curly chestnut hair, a shadow of stubble along his jaw, and a voice as soft as olive oil. He carried the scent of fresh lemon peel, thyme, and something else, maybe basil, maybe memory. Signora Grant. He greeted me with a bow. I cook. You enjoy. Enjoy? I smiled politely and led him to the kitchen. Luca didn't speak much, but he cooked like he was composing music. His knife danced through onions like fingers on piano keys. The wine bottle opened with a soft kiss. Olive oil hissed in the skillet like rain tapping a metal roof. I sat at the marble island in silence. For the first time in months, maybe years, someone else stood in this kitchen besides me. I don't remember the name. It was salmon, I think, marinated with blood orange and sage leaves. But I remember how he placed the plate on the table. Not like it was food, but like it was something sacred. He stepped back, waiting. I picked up the fork, took a bite, chewed, swallowed. He stood there watching me. I smiled faintly. It's good. He raised an eyebrow. Just good. I shrugged. I'm not much of a foodie. He chuckled lightly, the sound laced with vanilla and curiosity. Then, without any shift in tone, he asked, do you actually enjoy the food? Or do you just eat it? The room dropped several degrees. I didn't answer right away. I put the fork down. My eyes drifted to the pendant light, soft gold spilling across the counter like melted quiet. Enjoy it? What have I enjoyed lately? Not just meals, anything? I couldn't remember. Luca said nothing more. He poured wine into my glass, then stepped away, like he'd accidentally touched something fragile and didn't want to break it further. I sat in the living room, wine glass in hand. Jazz hummed from the old record player like breath behind my thoughts. His question looped in my head. Do you enjoy it? Or just consume it? I thought about my marriage. Dinners filled with silence, vacations where we booked separate rooms. A man who used to press his lips against my wrist while I cooked, now only texting if a flight was delayed. And I realized something. I couldn't taste anything anymore. Not in food, not in love, not in myself. Luca hadn't left yet. He was in the pantry preparing ingredients for the next day. I stood, walked to the kitchen doorway. Luca, I said softly. He turned. I'm sorry if I seemed cold earlier, I said. My voice shook like butter on a hot pan. He smiled gently. It's all right. Most people eat their whole lives without ever knowing what they actually want. I nodded, but deep down I knew. I'd never truly asked myself what I wanted to taste. Or who. It started with the smallest things. Like the way Luca would open a window every morning so the rosemary bush could breathe into the kitchen. Or how he'd plate even the simplest toast with edible flowers, as if breakfast deserved reverence too. It wasn't the food that was making me feel alive again. It was the way anyone was choosing to see the world through beauty. And slowly I realized, he was seeing me that way too. On the fourth morning I woke to the scent of something sweet. I hadn't requested breakfast, but when I walked down there it was. Ricotta pancakes with lemon zest, a single blackberry on top. My name written in chocolate on the rim of the plate. I stared at it like it was a note I wasn't meant to receive. You didn't have to do this, I said. Luca glanced up from the stovetop. You didn't have to thank me. Yet here we are. I sat, took a bite. It was tender light. The blackberry burst on my tongue like ink. I looked up. He was already watching me, but not the way men usually do. He looked like someone hoping I'd finally feel something. In the afternoons, I sat near the wide window facing the lake. I brought a journal but rarely wrote. Mostly, I watched the sunlight spill across the wooden floor while Luca hummed quietly as he prepped dinner. One day he brought over a small glass of limoncello and set it next to me. "You looked like someone who needed something sweet and sharp," he said. I laughed even though it wasn't funny. "That obvious, huh?" He didn't reply. But when our eyes met, I felt something shift. Not flirtation. Not yet. Something quieter. Like we were in the same room, but both standing on the edge of something unspeakable. One evening, after another candlelit dinner I hadn't asked for but didn't have the heart to decline, I stayed behind in the kitchen as Luca cleaned. I watched him move. He was quick but precise. There was care in every motion. A kind of intimacy in watching someone do something well without realizing they're being watched. I reached out to place a dish next to his. Our fingers brushed. We both froze. Just for a moment. Long enough to feel it wasn't just skin. It was electricity with nowhere to go. Then he pulled back. Cleared his throat. "Sorry." I nodded, pretending it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. It was the beginning of the thing I feared most. Curiosity. It was the 6th night. Richard hadn't called in days. The air was humid. A thunderstorm trembled somewhere out on the lake. I poured myself a second glass of wine after dinner and sat alone at the kitchen counter. Luca was putting away herbs. I didn't realize I'd spoken out loud until I heard my own voice say, "Why do you do this?" He turned. "Do what?" "All this." I gestured at the food, the candlelight, the plates too pretty to eat from. "It's just me here." He leaned against the counter. "I don't cook for a crowd, Isabel. I cook for one person at a time. That's enough. If that person is paying attention." I let out a quiet breath. No one's paid attention to me in years. His voice dropped lower. "That's not true." And then he said it. "Are you happy?" I froze. My hands gripped the stem of the wine glass a little too tightly. Was I happy? I opened my mouth to respond, out of politeness, habit, defense, but no words came. It wasn't that I didn't know the answer. It was that I'd never thought about the question seriously. Not until someone asked it and actually waited. I looked at him. He didn't push. Didn't fill the silence. Just watched me with the patience of someone who understood the weight of quiet. I turned away, heart pounding. I whispered. I forgot what happy is supposed to feel like. That night I couldn't sleep. At nearly 1 a.m. I slipped out of bed, put on a sweater, and stepped barefoot onto the back porch. The lake shimmered under the moonlight. Still. Unbothered. Like a painting untouched by human hands. I heard the door behind me open. Luca stepped out, silent. He had a blanket draped over one arm. I hadn't heard his footsteps, but part of me had expected him to come. He handed me the blanket. Didn't say a word. Just stood beside me, looking at the water. Eventually he whispered, "There's something peaceful about things that don't need fixing." I nodded. I used to think I was peaceful. Turns out I was just quiet. We sat there together for what felt like hours. Saying nothing. Sharing everything. He told me about his childhood in Tuscany. His mother's garden. His father who used to hum the same 4-note song while shelling peas. I told him about the day Richard proposed, how it rained, how I thought the weather was trying to warn me. At some point I looked at Luca and said, "I'm scared." He didn't ask of what. Maybe he already knew. He just replied, "So am I." And that scared me more than anything, because it meant we were already on the same page of a story we hadn't meant to start. As I went inside that night, I realized something I hadn't felt in years. Someone saw me. Not the woman I performed every day. Not the perfect wife or the graceful host. But the woman who stood barefoot in silence at midnight, wrapped in a borrowed blanket, with a question lingering in her bones. If I could choose again, would I choose this life? I didn't know the answer yet. But I knew I'd never ask the question. Until he did. It was never about touch. Not at first. It was about the way my breath shortened every time I entered a room and found him already there. It was the way he paused before speaking to me, like he was waiting to make sure I was listening, not just hearing. And the truth was, I was listening to him more than I'd ever listened to my own husband. After that night by the lake, I began avoiding him. Not fully. Not directly. But I started skipping breakfast. I'd leave the kitchen before dinner was done. I told myself it was because I needed space, but what I feared was how small the space between us had become. I began leaving notes instead of speaking. Just toast today, please. Dinner for one. I'll eat later. Thank you. He never replied in writing, but he answered anyway through food. Toast came with warm pear compote. Dinner included a folded napkin shaped like a swan. And on the third morning I found a single rosemary sprig tied with a ribbon on my plate. No words. Just scent and presence. That week I started noticing things I shouldn't have. The way he brushed flour off his fingers, delicately, as if every movement meant something. The scar beneath his thumb. The way he hummed when he was comfortable, but stopped when I entered, then resumed a few minutes later when the silence between us had softened. And most dangerously, I started noticing how much I wanted to notice him. One afternoon the house was filled with the smell of garlic, tomato, and basil. I walked into the kitchen just as he pulled a tray of eggplant parmesan from the oven. "It's my mother's recipe," he said. "She used to make it when she missed someone." I said nothing. Just sat. My mouth was full. My eyes too. He slid a dish in front of me and poured wine without asking. "I hope it tastes like memory," he whispered. I looked at him, startled. He smiled. "Some flavors aren't new. They just remind us of something we've lost." That night I cried into my pillow, and I didn't know why. Not fully. Only that someone had cooked something for me, not because they had to, but because they wanted me to feel something again. This was not a love affair. We had not kissed. Had not touched in any way that could be written down as betrayal. But I was betraying Richard. With every glance. With every question I allowed myself to ask silently in Luca's presence. What would his hands feel like if he traced the back of my neck? What would his mouth taste like, with the wine he always poured for me? I didn't act. But in my heart, I'd already crossed oceans. It rained for 3 days. Long heavy rains that made the lake rise and the windows sweat. On the third night we lost power. The house fell into a soft velvety darkness. Luca lit candles along the counter. The room flickered. Shadows danced across his jawline. "I'm making risotto," he said softly. "It's a dish that demands patience." I leaned on the counter. "And attention." He looked at me. "Exactly." I couldn't look away. "Luca," I began. He didn't let me finish. "I know," he said. "You don't have to say it." But I wanted to. I wanted to say, "I feel alive again, and I hate that it's not because of my husband." I wanted to say, "I haven't slept a full night since you asked if I was happy." I wanted to say, "Don't go." Instead I nodded once, picked up my wine, and stayed beside him, breathing in the steam, knowing that something irreversible had begun. We had dinner by candlelight. No music. No talking. Just the sound of rain outside and our forks scraping gently across the plates. Halfway through the meal I looked up and whispered, "Are you scared?" He paused. Swallowed. "Every day," he said. "But not because I don't know what I want. Because I do." After the plates were cleared, I walked him to the back hallway. The power hadn't returned. We stood by the stairwell in the dim flicker of candlelight. I reached for his hand, not to hold it but to say thank you, to acknowledge what we weren't saying. But I stopped halfway. Instead he reached for the wall switch and tried the lights again. Nothing. And then he said, "Sometimes the dark tells us what the light was too proud to say." I stared at him. He didn't move closer. Neither did I. And still I felt like he just unzipped my skin with a sentence. That night I stood at my mirror and looked at myself for the first time in weeks. Really looked. Noticed the softness around my jaw. The wrinkle near my left eyebrow. Not flaws, reminders. Proof that I was still here. Still someone. Someone who could be seen. Desired. Stirred. My husband had not touched me in weeks. Luca had never touched me once. And yet, I wasn't mine anymore. The week my husband returned, the air changed. It wasn't just his cologne trailing through the hallway, or the heavier footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. It was the way the doors no longer stayed open. The way the silence between meals no longer felt peaceful but loaded. The way I had to remind myself who I was supposed to be. Richard came home on a Thursday afternoon. He didn't call ahead. He walked through the front door with a suitcase in one hand, laptop bag in the other, and his usual detached efficiency. "I thought you'd be in the garden," he said. "Didn't expect you inside." "I was reading," I lied. He kissed my cheek quickly, eyes scanning the room. "Smells like roasted duck. You've been cooking again." "No," I said. "The chef's still here." He paused, just long enough for my stomach to tighten. That night, for the first time, Luca cooked with someone else in the house besides me. The dining room felt smaller. The candles flickered against the glass like nervous fingers. Richard poured his own wine, something he hadn't done in years. He tasted the duck, nodded politely. "Impressive," he said to Luca, who bowed his head. Then Richard turned to me. "I hope this has made you feel better." Better. As if I'd been sick. I smiled. Not because I meant it, but because there was no safe response. Luca served dessert. Lavender panna cotta. The spoon clinked against porcelain. I barely tasted it. Richard wasn't cruel. He wasn't loud. He was simply present now, in the way a full glass takes up space on a table, keeping you from placing anything else there. Luca adapted. He spoke less, served faster, avoided my gaze unless necessary. But I felt it. The fracture. The thing between us that had grown without ever touching, now under a microscope. It was a Sunday afternoon. I was out watering the hydrangeas when I heard the sound, glass breaking. I rushed inside. Luca was standing in the kitchen, towel wrapped around his hand. Blood. A lot of it. On the counter. On the cutting board. On the floor. Richard stood across from him, arms folded. Silent. "What happened?" I asked, rushing to Luca. "The knife slipped," he said. But his eyes told a different story. Richard didn't offer help. Didn't move. I grabbed the first aid kit from the cabinet and took Luca's hand. My fingers shook. He flinched slightly, not from pain, but from the way I touched him. Too familiar. Too slow. Too much. Richard saw it. I know he did. Later that night, I found Richard in his study, standing by the window. "You're quiet," I said. He didn't turn around. "Do you like him?" I froze. "Like who?" He finally turned. "The chef. The boy." "He's not a boy," I said too quickly. "And no, he's just here." "Not for long," he replied. "I think it's time we let him go. We're back to normal now." Normal. The word scraped against my ribs like sandpaper. I nodded. But I think I died a little in that moment. That night I wrote a letter. Not to Luca. Not to Richard. To myself. I wrote, "You knew it was never about the touch. It was about the way someone made you feel like a person again. Like you were allowed to be seen, to be tasted, to be remembered. And now you're choosing silence again. You're choosing safe. But don't lie to yourself. This is not normal. This is numb." I folded the letter and tucked it into a cookbook. Someplace only I would ever look. The next evening, Luca served one final dinner. He didn't say it was the last. He didn't have to. Everything about the meal said goodbye. Handmade gnocchi with brown butter sage. Caramelized figs and burrata. A red wine so rich it made me dizzy. He placed a small chocolate tart in front of me. The plate was white. Empty. Except for one word, written in dark syrup. Grazie. I looked up. He smiled. But it was the kind of smile people wear when they've already left. That night, I stayed in the kitchen long after everyone had gone to bed. I ran my fingers along the counter where the blood had stained, where the tart had sat, where my life had started to feel like mine again for just a moment. And I whispered, into the dim, empty space, "Thank you for asking if I was happy." Because no one else had. Not in years. By the time I returned upstairs, the guest room was empty. The scent of lemon, rosemary, and something sweeter had faded from the hallway. There had been no kiss. No affair. Nothing to name. But something had broken. And it hadn't been the knife. Luca was gone. Just like that. No goodbye. No note. No trace of rosemary or burnt sugar in the air. And yet everything in the house carried him. The rhythm of the faucet. The way sunlight pooled in the hallway near the kitchen at 4 p.m. Even the cupboard doors remembered the way he opened them, slowly, like he respected their silence. The next morning I woke to make my own coffee. The kitchen had never felt larger. The stove quiet. The countertops too clean. The absence of music made the air feel heavy. I reached for the coffee tin. My fingers hesitated. It was the same coffee Luca once brewed for me, strong, dark, with a hint of cinnamon. I closed the lid and walked away. It didn't taste the same anymore. That evening, Richard sat across from me at the dining table. No chef. No candles. Just reheated soup and cold bread. "Did he say anything to you before he left?" he asked. I shook my head. He leaned back. "He was too familiar with you. I saw it. I was too familiar with myself when he was around," I said quietly. He blinked. I remembered myself. For the first time in a long time. Richard said nothing. He picked up his spoon, stirred the soup, then set it down. "We have a good life," he said. "We have a functional life," I replied. There was no argument. No storm. Just two people sitting across from each other. Eating what was left. Of something that had ended long before it actually ended. Days passed. I found myself in the garden more often. Hands buried in soil, pruning roses that refused to bloom. I started writing again. Not letters to myself but fragments. Sentences. Images. Memories of a man who never touched me but left fingerprints on every room I entered. One evening I wrote, "He didn't ruin my marriage. He reminded me that I had abandoned myself." And I cried. For what I had missed. For what I hadn't said. For the fact that sometimes the deepest betrayals are the ones where we betray our own aliveness. One night, after too much wine, I started to write to Luca. "Dear Luca, I wanted to thank you. Not for the food, but for asking me the one question that haunted me into remembering who I used to be. I wasn't happy, but the moment you asked, I realized I wasn't dead either. I never sent it. I tore it up. Because some words don't need to reach the person. They just need to reach the truth." One Sunday I set the table. For two. Out of habit or hope, I'm still not sure. I lit a single candle, placed a glass of red wine on the left, and waited. No one came, but something inside me finally did. Weeks later, Richard left for another business trip. I didn't ask when he'd return. I didn't make dinner. I didn't need to. Instead, I sat at the kitchen counter sipping tea, listening to the wind through the rosemary bush outside the window. That same bush he used to open the window for, just so the leaves could breathe. Luca wasn't a love story. He was a mirror. He was a reminder that the body can go untouched and still be unraveled. That a question, "Are you happy?" can echo longer than a lifetime of answers. And sometimes, what feels like infidelity isn't to a person. It's to the version of yourself you left behind. In exchange for silence, safety, and never being asked. Anything that made you tremble.